It's such an honor to be on this panel with these courageous individuals. And a new whistleblower has joined the ranks of the whistleblowers we have here with us today. This is an unknown person who has chose to remain anonymous because the Obama administration has so aggressively gone against whistleblowers, as Jess said, charging many people with the Espionage Act, which was not at all passed originally for this purpose, but in the belief that the American public has the right to know about the fundamentally and morally flawed U.S. drone program, this anonymous source provided The Intercept with a treasure trove of secret military documents and slides that shine a critical light on the country's killer drone program. And this came out recently. This was in November of last year. And these files confirm that the Obama administration's policy and practice of assassination using armed drones and other methods violate the law. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute. The documents reveal the kill chain that decides who will be targeted. And as the source said, this outrageous explosion of watch listing, of monitoring people and racking and stacking them on lists, assigning them numbers, assigning them baseball cards, assigning them death sentences without notice on a worldwide battlefield, it was, from the very first instance, wrong. These secret documents demonstrate that the administration kills innumerable civilians due to its reliance on signals intelligence in undeclared war zones. They follow cell phones or computers that are allegedly carried by terrorists, but a person might have a cell phone, give it to his mother, and his mother becomes the target. The documents show that more than half of the intelligence used to locate potential targets in Somalia and Yemen were based on this method. The source said it isn't a surefire method. You're relying on the fact that you do have all these powerful machines capable of collecting extraordinary amounts of data and intelligence, which can cause those involved to think they possess godlike powers. It's stunning the number of instances when selectors are misattributed to certain people. And he characterized a missile fired at a target in a group of people as a leap of faith. The administration's practice of minimizing civilian casualties is, according to the source, exaggerating at best, if not outright lies. From January 2012 to February 2013, a campaign called Operation Haymaker was carried out in the Afghan provinces of Kunar and Nuristan. And according to the drone papers, during a 5-month period, almost 90% of the people killed in airstrikes were not the intended targets. This campaign paralleled an increase in drone attacks and civilian casualties throughout Afghanistan. What's more, the campaign did not significantly degrade al-Qaeda's operations there. Obama's preference for killing instead of apprehension, and they call it capturing, I call it apprehension, animals are captured, people are apprehended, but they call it capture. His preference for killing rather than apprehension, and we know this even though he says he doesn't do that, because he has added only one individual to the ranks of Guantanamo during his presidency. But actually it prevents the administration. Killing all of these people prevents the administration from gathering critical intelligence. Obama stated in 2013, America does not take strikes when we have the ability to capture individual terrorists. Our preference is always to detain, interrogate, and prosecute. But Michael Flynn, former head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, told The Intercept, we don't capture people anymore. And the slides provided by the drone papers source cite a 2013 study by the Pentagon's Intelligence, Surveillance, and Reconnaissance Task Force that said kill operations significantly reduce the intelligence available from detainees and captured material. And the task force recommended capture and interrogation rather than killing in drone strikes. But the American public is largely unaware of the high number of civilian casualties from drone strikes. A study conducted by American University political science professor Jeffrey Bachman concluded that both the New York Times and the Washington Post substantially underrepresented the number of civilians killed in drone strikes in Pakistan and Yemen, failed to correct the public record when evidence emerged that the reporting was wrong, and ignored the importance of international law. And an expert on national security and drones at Pepperdine Law School, Gregory McNeil, wrote that in Afghanistan and Iraq, when collateral damage, that is civilian casualties, did occur, 70% of the time it was attributable to failed, that is mistaken, identification. Anyone caught in the vicinity is guilty by association, according to the drone paper's source. If a drone attack kills more than one person, there is no guarantee that those persons deserve their fate. So it's a phenomenal gamble. Drones are Obama's weapon of choice because they don't result in U.S. casualties. And one thing that the U.S. learned from Vietnam is that Americans don't like to see other Americans coming home in body bags. When they don't hear about foreigners being killed, or when we read in the New York Times, 4 militants were killed. What's a militant? I mean, we're very militant about things, but 4 militants were killed. People think, oh, you know, well, that doesn't concern us. But according to Dennis Blair, the director of national intelligence, it is the politically advantageous thing to do. Low cost, no U.S. casualties, gives the appearance of toughness. It plays well domestically. And it is unpopular only in other countries. Any damage it does to the national interest only shows up over the long term. Part of the damage is that drones make the fallen into martyrs. They create a new reason to fight us even harder, he said. Now, there is this concept of American exceptionalism, and that is that somehow people in this country are superior to everyone in other countries. Obama says this often in his State of the Union addresses. He told the General Assembly. Some may disagree, but I believe America is exceptional, in part because we have shown a willingness, through our sacrifice of blood and treasure, to stand up not only for our own narrow self-interest, but for the interests of all. Of course, in addition to U.S. soldiers killed in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere, hundreds of thousands of people in those countries have been killed and untold numbers wounded. Time columnist Joe Klein, who is considered by many people to be a liberal, bought into American exceptionalism in a particularly disturbing way in an interview by Joe Scarborough on Morning Joe on MSNBC. Scarborough said, "You have 4-year-old girls being blown to bits because we have a policy that says, you know what, instead of trying to go in, take the risk, get the terrorists out of hiding, we're just going to blow everyone up around them." And he mentioned collateral damage. Joe Klein responded, "The bottom line in the end is whose 4-year-old gets killed. What we're doing is limiting the possibility that 4-year-olds here are going to get killed by indiscriminate acts of terror. So it's preferable that foreign little girls get killed as opposed to U.S. American little girls." American exceptionalism reared its head after the 2013 leak of a Department of Justice white paper that contained guidelines for the targeted killing of U.S. citizens. And before that, Americans were not terribly concerned about drone killings of people in other countries. Of course, we're shielded from the images of the children blown up by drones and from their stories, the stories of the victims' families and the survivors. But this led to Senator Rand Paul's 13-hour filibuster of John Brennan's nomination for CIA director. And it is this double standard that motivated Archbishop Desmond Tutu, Nobel Peace Prize winner, one who deserved the Nobel Peace Prize, to write a letter to the editor of the New York Times in which he asked, do the United States and its people really want to tell those of us who live in the rest of the world that our lives are not of the same value as yours? That President Obama can sign off on a decision to kill us with less worry about judicial scrutiny than if the target is an American? Would your Supreme Court really want to tell humankind that we, like the slave Dred Scott in the 19th century, are not as human as you are? I cannot believe it. I used to say of apartheid that it dehumanized its perpetrators as much as, if not more than, its victims. Your response as a society to Osama bin Laden and his followers threatens to undermine your moral standards and your humanity. Now, when I read that letter to the editor, I was putting together this collection that Anne referred to, and I thought to myself, it would be wonderful if Archbishop Tutu could write the foreword to this book, and he graciously agreed, and he elaborates on this whole notion of American exceptionalism in his foreword. Now, the United Nations Charter requires, first of all, it was enacted after 2 world wars where millions of people had died, and specifically to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. Now, it has not been altogether successful, but the Charter's mandate for peaceful resolutions of disputes and prohibition of military force except in self-defense is not a pipe dream. A study by the RAND Corporation concluded that between 1968 and 2006, 43% of incidents involving terrorist groups ended by a peaceful political resolution with their government. 40% were penetrated and eliminated by local police and intelligence agencies, and only 7% were ended by the use of military force. Nevertheless, the Wall Street Journal reported that the military plans to increase drone flights by 50% in 2019. In describing the special operations, how the special operations community views the prospective targets for assassination by drone, the drone paper's source said, they have no rights, they have no dignity, they have no humanity to themselves. They're just a selector to an analyst. You eventually get to a point in the target's life cycle that you are following them. You don't even refer to them by their actual name. This results in dehumanizing the people before you've even encountered the moral question of, is this a legitimate kill or not? Now, one of the essays in this book, the only one that's been reprinted from elsewhere, was written by Jane Mayer in the New Yorker in 2009. It's called The Predator War, and it was the first comprehensive study of the drone program. And Jane Mayer interviewed Vicki Duvall, a former CIA lawyer who now teaches at the U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis. And back in 2009, Vicki Duvall said, people are a lot more comfortable with a Predator drone strike that kills many than with a throat slitting that kills one. And that's really true. I mean, when we hear about ISIS beheading someone, we are justifiably outraged. Of course, we're not so outraged when we hear about one of our close allies, Saudi Arabia, beheading people on a nearly daily basis. But again, we don't hear about what our drones are doing to people in other countries. As the news broke on March the 7th of this year that a U.S. drone strike had killed 150 people in Somalia, the White House announced that it will reveal for the first time the number of people killed by drones and manned airstrikes outside of areas of active hostilities since 2009. The tallies will include civilian deaths, and we'll see how forthcoming they are. This is a critical first step toward much needed transparency, but it will not go far enough. The Obama administration has been lying for years about how many deaths result from its drone strikes and manned bombers. In 2011, John Brennan, who used to be Obama's counterterrorism advisor, now he's the CIA director, falsely claimed that no civilians had been killed in drone strikes in nearly a year. And the Bureau of Investigative Journalism that Sean referred to, and is really, I think, one of the premier organizations for tallying and documenting civilian casualties. They're out of London. And other non-governmental organizations that calculate drone deaths put the lie to Brennan's claim. It's believed that, that of the estimated 5,000 people killed on Obama's watch, approximately 1,000 were civilians. But the administration has never released complete casualty figures. Plus, the numbers by themselves are not sufficient. Even if the White House makes good on its promise to publicize death tallies, it must also publicize the presidential policy guidance, which has provided the legal justification for the U.S. targeted killing program. In May 2013, responding to international criticism about his drone program, and while detainees at Guantanamo were starving themselves to death, Obama delivered a speech at the National Defense University in Washington, D.C. And Obama proclaimed, once again, America does not take strikes when we have the ability to capture individual terrorists. Our preference is always to detain, interrogate, and prosecute them. Now, as he gave that speech, the White House released a fact sheet that purported to contain preconditions for the use of lethal force outside of active hostilities. But the presidential policy guidance on which the fact sheet was based remains classified. So what does that fact sheet say? Well, first, it says there must be a legal basis for the use of lethal force. It doesn't define whether a legal basis includes complying with our ratified treaties. And many in our government don't care much for treaties. Some on the Supreme Court don't care much for ratified treaties. I won't mention any names. But when the United States ratifies a treaty, it becomes part of U.S. law under the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution. Treaties shall be the supreme law of the land. And three in particular, the UN Charter, the Geneva Conventions, and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, are part of U.S. law, not just international law. The UN Charter, as I said, prohibits the use of military force except in self-defense. The Geneva Conventions prohibit the targeting of civilians and require that the country using military force distinguish between civilians and combatants. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights protects due process and the right to life. Now, the Obama administration justifies its drone strikes by referring to the 2001 authorization for the use of military force, or the AUMF, that Congress gave Bush after the 9/11 attacks. But that limits the use of military force, or necessary measures, which is a euphemism for military force, to groups that were implicated in the 9/11 attacks or assisted with the 9/11 attacks. Al-Shabaab, which is supposedly who the U.S. was targeting with when these 150 people died in Somalia earlier this month, did not even exist in 2001. Neither did ISIS. In fact, ISIS didn't really exist until the U.S. destabilized Iraq and Libya by its regime change, creating a vacuum which ISIS is filling. It's the ultimate in blowback. And evidently, apparently, the people that were killed were they say they were Al-Shabaab terrorists. They were assembled, according to the U.S. administration, for a graduation ceremony. I guess you'd have a graduation ceremony, and then you're going to become an imminent threat immediately to people, I suppose, the United States. Because the next requirement of the fact sheet is that the target must pose a continuing imminent threat to U.S. persons. But the fact sheet does not define continuing or imminent. The Department of Justice white paper that was leaked in 2013 says that a U.S. citizen can be killed, as a U.S. citizen, even where there is no clear evidence that a specific attack on U.S. persons and interests will take place in the imminent future. So what do you mean? What does imminent mean? And presumably the administration sets an even lower bar for non-citizens. For third, the fact sheet says that there must be near certainty that the terrorist target is present. But the fact sheet doesn't mention signature strikes, also known as crowd killings, where the administration blows up people. They don't even name them. If it's an area of suspicious activity and you're a male from the ages of 16, or I guess maybe even 12, as Sean said, to 65 in an area of suspicious activity, then you can be blown up. And you are considered to be a terrorist unless there is intelligence posthumously proving you innocent. Then there must be near certainty that non-combatants will not be injured or killed. Well, when you're doing crowd killings, how do you know? And again, anyone in a strike zone who's a male basically is fair game. Then there must be an assessment that capture is not feasible. It's unclear what feasibility means, but if you read the Department of Justice white paper, infeasible sounds like inconvenient. And it certainly was feasible to apprehend and put on trial Osama bin Laden because he was not armed at the time that the US military assassinated him. There must be an assessment that the relevant governmental authorities in the country where the action is contemplated cannot or will not effectively address the threat to US persons, left undefined. And there must be an assessment that no other reasonable alternatives exist to address the threat to US persons, also left undefined. But the fail-safe is that the fact sheet would excuse all of these preconditions when the president takes action in extraordinary circumstances, which are both lawful and necessary to protect the United States or its allies. There's no definition of extraordinary circumstances or what would be lawful. So releasing the presidential policy guidance would fill in the gaps left by the fact sheet. Now, in February of this year, the Stimson Task Force, it's a bipartisan task force on drone policy, gave the Obama administration an F in 3 areas the task force had flagged for improvement in its June 2014 report. First, progress in releasing information on drone strikes. Second, explaining the legal basis under US and international law for the drone program. And third, developing a more robust oversight and accountability mechanism for targeted strikes outside of traditional battlefields. So regarding, I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to go through all of these in detail. But former CIA Director Michael Hayden mounted a full-throated defense of the US drone program in a February 2016 New York Times op-ed. Hayden claimed the targeted killing program has been the most precise and effective application of firepower in the history of armed conflict, annihilating the ranks of al-Qaeda. But it's impossible to verify his claims without documentation. And Hayden also said, we kill people based on metadata. That's, you know, about metadata from Edward Snowden. They are keeping tabs on all the websites we visit, the calls we make, etc. They say they're not reading the content, but they have all of that information. Ars Technica recently revealed that the NSA's Skynet program, which uses an algorithm to gather metadata in order to identify and target terrorist suspects, would result in 99,000 false positives. Nevertheless, Obama said in an interview in The Atlantic that he has no second thoughts about drone strikes in the Middle East. Now, I've testified, and I have a few copies of my book, Rules of Disengagement, The Politics and Honor of Military Dissent, where I describe my testimony in some military courts-martial and other military hearings, mainly in the sentencing phase, and we've had some success with this, where service members have refused to deploy to Iraq or Afghanistan, saying that those were illegal wars and they might be put in the position of committing war crimes, torture, etc. And so my testimony is to corroborate the reasonableness of their beliefs. And the Uniform Code of Military Justice and the Nuremberg Principles establish a duty to obey lawful orders, but a duty to disobey unlawful orders in my testimony was that in order to deploy to an unlawful war, where you might be put in a position of following orders to commit war crimes, is an unlawful order, and you're justified in disobeying it. And it is my feeling that this defense could also be used for drone pilots who refuse to carry out orders, direct orders, really, to kill people with drones. Now, terrorism, this whole global war on terror, and I was interested to learn that there's a medal, Global War on Terror medal. Terrorism is not an enemy, it's a tactic, and you don't declare war on a tactic, and yet under the guise of this so-called war on terror, Bush and now Obama have systematically shredded our laws. And bottom line is that, I mean, we can talk about how we're going to fight the terrorists, but until we step back and completely reevaluate our foreign policy and stop invading other countries and killing their people, torturing their people, occupying their countries, and uncritically supporting other countries that illegally occupy other people's lands, we will never be safe from terrorism. Thank you.